next speaker is going to be talking about a skeptic's guide to mental health. So this is going to complement a lot of stuff that you guys heard from Linda really well. She is the better half of JT Everhart. Nod your head. She has a bachelor's degree of science. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in Behavioral Neuroscience from the University of Kansas. Please welcome Michaelyn Everhart.
Okay, I made it up the stairs. I didn't trip. I'm in heels. It's really impressive. Like you said, my name is Michaelyn. I study Behavioral Neuroscience at KU. I just recently found out I'm going to med school in July. So that starts soon. I'm really excited. I plan to pursue psychiatry or neurology. I'm still figuring that one out, but something to do with the brain. And today I'm going to be talking to you about mental health, mental disorders. Linda gave an excellent presentation, and when they announced your topic, I was so afraid that this was going to overlap so much, and I was like, no, I was just going to say everything, and I'm just going to be repeating her, but no, this is, your talk was great, and I think we're going to complement each other really well, so excellent. I really enjoyed your presentation. Yeah, so this talk is going to be kind of a little different. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take some common misconceptions and I'm going to tell you what the reality is. I don't want to insult you. I don't want you to think that I'm up here saying, you all believe these misconceptions and you're so wrong and I'm here to tell you what's right. In reality, I know that this is a pretty well-informed crowd. So my idea is just that I want to arm you with this knowledge so that when you do hear people kind of saying things that aren't true, you'll be like, no, actually I heard this in Michaelyn's talk and she said that this was true and here was her source. That's kind of my goal for today. So that's going to be part one of the talk, and then part two is I've taken some common questions that people have asked me, that people from the skeptic community, either from JT's blog or just kind of on Facebook, questions that they asked me regarding mental health, and I just gone and prepped some slides from those questions, and then I'd love to take your questions too. So let's get going. Here's our first misconception, and Linda actually went over this one too. It's that mental disorders are rare. And she gave us the stat of 1 in 4 adults. Well, she said, 1 in 4, but it's 1 in 4 adults experience mental illness in a given year. And we see about 20% of youth ages 13 to 18 experience actually severe mental disorders. So that is quite a lot of our population who is living with this. The sad side of the statistic is that 60% of these adults and 50% of the youth ages 8 through 15 that do have a mental illness failed to seek any kind of mental health services in the past year. And that's kind of a complicated topic as well. I think I touch on this a bit later, but access to therapy, to psychiatry, to any mental health services is actually really, really difficult. It can be very expensive. There are very long wait lists to get in with some therapists, and often insurance doesn't cover it. So there are a lot of barriers to getting help. Oh, look, source. These stats are from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI or NAMI, I don't actually know. That's from 2013. So the next misconception, therapy is a waste of money. We're just paying somebody to talk about my problems. I do that with my friends, so why should I pay somebody to just go talk? And it's true that talking is a big part of therapy, and talking can be very therapeutic. But when we're with a therapist, it's important to remember that these are trained professionals. Your friends are probably not going to be using evidence-based therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, all these fancy letters that a therapist is hopefully using, and I'll get onto that a little more later. But most therapists your good therapists are going to be using evidence-based treatments that are going to make a difference in your disorder. Mental health problems result, I'm sorry, can you all hear me? Am I turning away? Okay, good. Mental health problems result from laziness or other character flaws. They can be solved if a person would just try harder. Just get out of bed, go exercise, get in the sunlight, you're gonna feel better. Mental illness and mental disorders are physiological, they're chemical, they're happening in the brain, and they are an illness. And this misconception isn't something that people without mental disorders believe. This is actually something that's really ingrained frequently with people who are living with mental disorders. They tend to blame themselves, feel very guilty, think that it's their fault, that they're feeling so down that they can't find this motivation to get out of bed or to function in society. But in the end of it, it's no one's fault. Exactly. See, I knew what I was saying. It's an illness. No one is to blame. It's nobody's fault that this is happening. And I have this clip. This is a campaign called Hope for Depression. And I actually saw this play. It was a Hulu advertisement. It's the only Hulu ad that I've ever not hated. Have you guys heard the Oprah with the I love bread advertisement? It drives me nuts, and it always plays like 3 times in a row, and it's terrible. But this, I was just so excited to see this, to see some sanity in my Hulu advertisement, which was great. So I want to show you this. Maybe.
Really, a lot of people are worse off than you know.
Getting tired of hearing about this.
Oh, honey, snap out of it.
You're kind of driving me down. Why don't you just go outside, get some sunshine, and be fine? Bye.
Can we stop with the pity party?
Okay, so super cool, super enlightening for a Hulu ad, right? Awesome. So yeah, I think this really hammers in that depression and other mental disorders, these are illnesses, these are disorders. And when society and even as, we as friends with people living with these disorders, when we start saying, well, why don't you just get up? Why don't you just go outside? And you're really dragging me down. We start placing the blame on them. It just starts this cycle where people are, less likely to go out and seek help because they start thinking it's just something, this is my fault, it's something I could fix if I really could find that motivation, and then they're less likely to go out and seek treatment. Okay, and Linda also spoke a little bit on this, but so people with mental health issues are more violent. This just is not true. When you take a look at the statistics, when we're talking about violent crime, remember Linda was talking to us about nonviolent crime for the most part, but when we look at stats for violent crimes, only 3% of those can be attributed to severe mental illness. That's 3%. 97% of violent crimes have nothing to do with a mental disorder. So that's huge. We really overestimate this. People with severe mental illnesses, however, are 10 times more likely to be victims of violent crime. And according to many surveys, the general population grossly overestimates the correlation between mental illness and violent crime. So just remember the stat, 3%, it's super small. So this is one I hear a lot. If somebody is wrong or if they're being irrational, then they're mentally ill. I hear this a lot in the atheist community. Nope. They're not ill. I have very little patience for this argument too. I think it's because I hear it so much though. Humans are irrational. Our brains are actually not designed to be rational. We've evolved over thousands of years, and it's, our brain is very efficient, but that doesn't make us these perfect rational beings. We have a lot of emotions and things get in the way, and we are wrong all the time. So when you're arguing with somebody, be it about religion or their belief in God or somebody of a different political party than you, you're about to say, why don't you go see a therapist because your ideas are just crazy. Why don't you take a step back and maybe ask yourself why you've jumped to that conclusion instead of rationalizing it out with somebody else. Those are the two most common. So yeah, and I actually give a whole other talk on why being religious is not a mental illness. So I'd be happy to take questions on that later if you're interested. On that note, so while I'm on my soapbox, just because you wash your hands regularly doesn't mean you have OCD. Just because you like to keep a tidy room, you're not OCD. Stop saying that. Saying I literally want to kill myself right now is not okay unless you're really having thoughts of suicide or thoughts of self-harm. Saying things like this really trivializes the experiences of people who are actually living with these disorders, living with suicidal thoughts. It's already hard enough to talk about. There's already a social stigma. Saying things like this really feeds into that social stigma. So there's nothing I can do to help people diagnosed with a mental illness. I'm not a therapist, I'm not a professional, I'm just somebody's friend. So this actually is not true either. I think the best thing you can do as a supportive friend is to learn to listen without judgment and without giving advice. And that's really hard to do. Because as a friend, we want to brainstorm, we want to tell them, the best thing that you can do, here's how we're going to fix this problem. But if you can just sit there and listen to their experience, nodding and saying, that sucks, can do wonders for somebody, just to validate what they're going through. And then once they have kind of talked it out and they're, maybe feeling a little better, feeling comfortable with you, if they ask you for help or for advice, that's totally great. Or if you think you've reached a point where maybe they would like some advice, it's okay to ask, hey, I have some ideas on maybe how we can get to use some help. Would you like to talk about that? And kind of, putting the ball in their court. So asking your friend if they're willing to see a doctor or therapist. And asking if they want help with that, because sometimes the hardest part is picking up that phone and calling the doctor's office and making that appointment. It's really hard to do. So if you can ask, hey, do you want me to dial this number? Do you want me to call and talk to the reception and schedule you an appointment? Do you want me to sit in the waiting room with you while you wait for that appointment? Making it known, only if you're comfortable as a friend, obviously, in doing that. But just making it known that they don't have to go through that alone can make a big difference. And continuing that, if you have a friend in a crisis situation, I am going to warn you, I am going to talk a little bit about suicide and self-harm, so if you're uncomfortable with that, please feel free to stand up, leave. I don't want to, trigger anyone. But if you have a friend who's saying that they're thinking about suicide, they're thinking about killing themselves, or hinting at, I don't want to be here anymore, I just don't know how to get better. There are some things you can do. Again, listen. Frequently, you're going to have a knee-jerk reaction where you're like, but you have so much to live for, and so many people love you, and don't kill yourself, and that's just going to stop the conversation completely. But if, one of the best things you can do is say, that sounds really hard, what's going on? Is one of the best questions you can ask. I worked for a year at a crisis and suicide hotline, and I can't tell you how many times I've asked that question, what's going on? If you're willing and you're comfortable, you can kind of like assess their safety, whether you're chatting with them or texting. You can ask, have you done anything to hurt yourself already? Are you in a safe place? Do you have anything like a gun or a knife with you? Can we get you in a place where you don't have that? Can I come over and stay with you? Can you come stay with me? Making sure they're not alone. But if you're not comfortable doing that, which is totally understandable, you have the option of calling a crisis hotline. They're always willing to listen to friends and kind of help brainstorm with you on what you can do for your friends. And here's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. You can call that 800 number and you'll be sent to probably a more local crisis place. And they'll talk to you about maybe some local resources you can help get for your friend, and they can even offer to call your friend for you, either on your behalf, say, hey, Mike called me and he's really concerned about you because you've been saying some things. Would you like to talk to somebody in our line? Or they can do it even anonymously, like, hey, we got a call from, a friend who's concerned about you and they just thought that you might want to talk to us. So that's always an option. You don't have to be the suicidal one or the one thinking about self-harm to call this number. And another kind of going off of that, another misconception is thinking, if I ask my friends if they're thinking about suicide or if they're thinking about self-harm, then I'm putting that idea in their head and, I don't want to make them think about that when maybe they aren't. This is not a new concept to people. I think everyone knows what suicide is, what self-harm is, and you're not putting this idea in their head. And honestly, if you ask in a non-judgmental way, hey, I'm really worried about you, have you been thinking about suicide? That can be just a huge relief to somebody who is so afraid of being a burden to their friends, to their family. And they didn't want to bring it up because they didn't want you to worry, but now you've kind of brought the topic up and they've been made feel comfortable disclosing that with you if you make it known that it's a safe place. So that's a really, really great question to ask if you're genuinely concerned about a friend. All right, so that kind of cuts the end of my misconceptions part. I'm gonna do, I think I have just 3 or 4 questions that I get commonly and then I'm gonna answer, and then I'd love to take your questions. How can we avoid faith-based counseling? I get this one a lot. This one kind of takes a little bit of research on your part if you're looking to establish care with a therapist. I actually found this great, hold on, I know I threw a lot of letters up there, bear with me for a second. So this is SAMHSA, it's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. I'm just going to call it SAMHSA. They have a website. If you Google SAMHSA Evidence-Based Registry, they have a huge alphabetic list of all these different evidence-based treatments. That includes treatments for alcoholism and drug abuse, which is so hard to find because all those 12-step programs rely on a higher power. So this is actually something that I just discovered researching for this question. So it's really great. I did list out some of the most common evidence-based treatments. So it's cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and then solutions-focused therapy. So you can usually go to, if your therapist has a website for their practice, many of them will list out the types of therapy that they're they're trained and certified in doing. So if they start listing things out like this, you can kind of know, yeah, okay, I'm going to get somebody who's doing really good evidence-based practice. What's not going to be helpful to you is actually going in with a therapist and asking them if they're religious. Because most therapists are trained not to disclose personal information if it's not relevant to the therapy, and usually they're going to think that their religious beliefs are not relevant, even if they do evangelize to their patients. So that's not going to get you very far. But if at any point you do feel, if you're in with your therapist and they start telling you that maybe your problem is spiritual, or they kind of start saying things that make you uncomfortable, you at any point can leave and go frank with your therapist. I know it's expensive and that really sucks, so you can do some homework, do some Google searching, but feel free to shop around too. And Daryl Ray mentioned this, but there's a great resource now to getting us hooked up with secular therapists. So these are therapists, counselors, psychiatrists. It's a registry. There's about, when I checked on Friday, it was 266 therapists are registered across the US. You put in your information anonymously, and you put in your zip code and how many miles out you want your radius to go. And then it'll get you in contact with a therapist who qualifies as a secular therapist. Now, it's all done anonymously. Many therapists don't want to make it known that, hey, I'm an atheist and I'm a therapist, because they're going to lose a lot of clients. So yeah, it is anonymous on both parts, but then they'll get you with somebody. So really, really great resource. Probably better for regions, I don't know, bigger cities kind of, since it's still growing, but hopefully in a few years it's really going to keep growing as it has been. A couple questions I got were how to deal with friends and family members who helpfully suggest the woo they found on the internet may help, well, just make this diet change, cut gluten out, and you'll feel better. And kind of on that note, if you have a religious family member who's suggesting that your problem is spiritual, if you're dealing with that, I'm really sorry, that sucks. I think it's perfectly acceptable to say to your friends or family member that, hey, I'm actually only comfortable seeing a therapist who does evidence-based treatment, or hey, my doctor's actually set out this plan for me, and I'm really going to trust my doctor here because they know what's best for me. And go ahead and set some boundaries. Let them know what you're comfortable with, that you're really not looking for advice right now on how to fix this, but just maybe some validation in what you're going through. And hopefully your family will understand. And then this last one, how to discern the difference between hallucination. Well, this is hallucination from a religious experience, such as seeing, how to discern hallucination from a religious experience. Got it. Such as seeing a vision, hearing a deity speak to you. So I'm going to go on a little neuroscience tangent. A hallucination, when you're listening to somebody talk to you, there's a part of your brain that lights up. It's usually on the left side, round about here. And it doesn't actually light up. I mean, on an fMRI, we see it's active. So when you hear something, like sound goes in your ear, your brain's like, hey, this is an outside source coming in. And you know how we all have that voice in our head that we can tell it's a conscious thing, like I can hear myself talking in my head, but I know that's me. I know that's coming from inside. It's actually a different part of our brain, more toward the middle, that's actively doing that. So that's kind of how we can discern what's coming from inside, what's coming from outside. But when somebody has an auditory hallucination, the same part of the brain that's working when we hear things from the outside is lighting up when somebody's having a hallucination. That's all we are, is our brains. So when you have this perception of this hallucination happening, you think it's an outside source. So that's what's happening in a real hallucination. Now, when people say that God speaks to them, I don't think they're actually having, well, some people are having a real hallucination and they should seek help. But for the majority of religious people who say that, you know, God speaks to me or I saw a sign, I don't think they're actually hallucinating. I think their brains have been primed to kind of look for signals, like they really want to see something from God. And so, you know, maybe a song comes on the radio and hear a lyric, and they're like, yes, this is what I needed to hear. God is speaking to me today. And then they go tell their friends, and their friends are like, yeah, this is amazing. God is speaking to you. I think that's the most common thing that's happening here. So the voice of God is sought out. They want to hear this. And maybe they get a feeling inside, and be like, I don't know, I just got this gut feeling telling me to go apply for this job, and God was speaking to me today, kind of thing. So they're looking for that feeling. It's positively reinforced within their community. And a real auditory hallucination is not something that people are seeking out. It's something that is happening. It's a disorder within the brain. So that's all I have as far as those questions.
You talked about helping people who, like close friends or people who are talking to you about potentially harming themselves. And I've had a phone call before, someone I didn't know, tell me that they were about to do something. And immediately I went to, can I connect you with the suicide hotline? Would you like to talk to someone? There was alcohol involved. They didn't want to do that. And I had no idea what to do. I'd never been trained in anything like that. And I didn't know how to respond. And so some people around me were saying, you know, you've got to find out where they are. You've got to send the police to their house. And I thought, maybe, but that sounds like just about the worst thing I could do is if they're already on edge and the cops show up, that may expedite whatever's going to happen. And so I completely locked up. I didn't know what to do in that situation. So is there anything in your training or crisis management you would suggest in that type of situation where I don't have a relationship with the individual? They just contact me because they know who I am and they've heard of me. They're like, I want you to know this is about to happen. And I feel this overwhelming desire or obligation rather to stop it somehow.
Man, that's really hard. So did you all hear David's kind of story? Somebody called him, he didn't really know them, they knew who he was, and they're telling him that they're suicidal, they're going to kill themselves, and you know he doesn't really know where they are. In our crisis training, we did have situations where we would call the police if we could get out of somebody their location, and if they had, you know, already done something to harm themselves, we would either call an ambulance or, you know, if we just thought it was appropriate and our supervisor thought it was appropriate, we would call the police. But in my community, our police were trained in crisis intervention.
I'm just wondering statistically, if the police show up in that situation, does that typically work out in favor of a positive end? Or do you know of any statistic that suggests that's a bad thing?
I think what's most likely to happen is that they're going to be involuntarily admitted to a hospital if they're found to be a danger to themselves or to others. I don't know the stats on that specifically, but I know what happened most frequently for us if we did call the police was that they would be admitted to the ER and then they would go through you know, all sorts of questions about, you know, go through a psych eval, and then they would either be admitted or sent home.
So as a quick response, is there anything I could say if they refuse to call the suicide hotline? Is there anything that you can suggest?
The best, like, one-liner is like, hey, it sounds like you're really seriously thinking about killing yourself right now, but on the other hand, you called me today, so it sounds like there's a part of you that wants to stay alive, even if that part is small, and I'm really worried about that. And then try to see if, you know, maybe, do you want to call the hotline? Do you want to see a doctor? Can I call an ambulance? Kind of thing. But put in that situation, I mean, man, that's tough. Did you have a
I was going to say, I had a similar situation, except it was someone that I was supervised that was taking suicide, and they called me. And I did call the police because they were able to help them, and they came back 2 years later.
That's awesome. So a case where you call the police, that's amazing. I'm so glad it worked out for you.
It turned out fine because what she told me later was she didn't know she was wrong.
Yeah, that happens a lot when we had calls on the crisis hotline. People just didn't know, they didn't want to call their friends or they didn't want to call their family members because they didn't want to be a burden. That's so common. But also, like, it had turned out differently. And David, I don't know what happened in your case. It's not your fault. Whatever happens, it is not your fault if someone doesn't seek out that help that they need. JT?
So, this is 1 in 4 people live with mental illness, but many more are touched by mental illness because it affects not only the person, but their friends and family. As a spouse of someone who suffers from severe mental depression, can you talk about what family and friends should expect being around someone like that and how to endure it?
So there's the part where you can be like a loving, supportive spouse, friend, family member, whatever. But there's also a point where I think you have to set a boundary and say that, I have to take care of me and my happiness too, because a lot of times when you are trying to take care of a friend in need or a spouse in need, it can be easy to kind of forget that, oh yeah, I've got needs too. So I think just regularly checking in with yourself, making sure you're okay, is very, very important, because it's actually very common for spouses of, especially with depression, if you have a spouse with depression, oftentimes those symptoms can kind of rub off on you, and it's hard to want to leave the house to go out when your spouse doesn't want to, and you feel guilty for having fun or like for having your own happiness, and that can be really hard. So honestly, considering therapy, if you're going through that, is not a bad idea either.
So on the treatment plan that you were investigating or researching there, can you speak to how much medication plays into that as far as percentages of medication and therapy as part of the treatment plan?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of that question.
I'm just saying, what from your research into this on treatment of mental illness and the therapies involved.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the medication side of that, like the percentages of treatment plans that involve medication, and to what extent medication plays in that treatment plan and therapy?
Yeah, so I don't know the actual numbers on how frequently medication is used or how often it's combined with therapy. I'm going to guess pretty high because the antidepressants are super, super common. Anti-anxiety medications are some of the most commonly prescribed medications when it comes to primary care, actually. So very, very commonly medications are used. And very commonly they are useful, but it's very important to sit down and really ask your doctor some questions about, well, what are these side effects going to be like? How long is this going to take for it to work? Because SSRIs can take up to a month to get an effective therapeutic treatment, and within that month, suicidal ideation can increase and depressive symptoms can increase, so it's a very dangerous time in a person's life. So it's just very important to be monitoring yourself and really talk to your doctor about what to expect and what those medications look like, because a lot of times, I mean, it's worth the cost if you do have side effects, but sometimes people don't think that it's worth it and they would rather, seek out therapy instead of medication. So it's all about what you're looking at doing. Yeah.
For some of us who have parents or family members in their 60s and 70s, and understand aging in that regard is an interesting process, but like one thing that I'm concerned about is seeing an emerging pattern of behavior in an elder loved one. I'm just like, is this something that I need to confront with them? Am I going to be that upset when I get to be that age? Or like, how does somebody in the position where I'm watching my parents start emerging patterns of behavior, sometimes similar to what you described, like, is this part of getting older for some people, or is this something I really need to be seriously concerned about? And how do I bring that to their attention, that I think I'm seeing something potentially self-destructive or deteriorating.
Yeah, that's a good question. Really hard to bring that up, especially with your parents.
Yeah.
I don't know, would they be open to you, asking about, hey, I'm concerned about your health? Would you?
I mean, there's the monthly phone call that happens, and then there's some things that are said that don't make a whole lot of sense, or that never actually happened. Okay, I'm a little bit worried here.
Yeah, and I wonder if coming at it from that angle, like, hey, I've been noticing some things, with your behavior, and I'm really concerned about your health, and I wonder if we could ask a doctor about it or something, if they would kind of go at it.
But they also live on the other side of the country, but there's
Yeah.
also the emotional element of it involved, where I'm under the impression something's going on that they don't want to talk about, but I can't force them to. There's that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know, I would say just asking them if they're willing to talk about it would be the first step, but it's hard to say, because I'm not in that situation.
One question, say you're living with someone who has emotional issues like bipolar and anxiety. How do you walk that fine line between helping them, with their problems, but at the same time not being a neighbor that's trying to over baby them to the point where they're not getting there because you're doing it?
Yeah, I would say as long as, they're seeking some sort of behavioral health services, they've got a plan with their doctor, they've got a plan with their therapist. I mean, it's not really our job as friends to be, trying to push them into doing more or less of what they want to do. It's important to respect their autonomy. So, I mean, it is sometimes people with mental disorders are in a place where it's hard to really be rational at times. But I think for the most part, respecting their autonomy and.
Well, in this case, it's like for my friend is going through therapy and medications and such, but certain things like applying for assistance, financial assistance, he puts them off because the anxiety is great, and I'm walking a fine line between encouraging him to do that, but at the same time, not wanting to sit down and do everything for him.
Yeah, no, I would say like continual encouragement to go do something, but it sounds like you've kind of set this boundary where, well, I'm not actually going to do this paperwork for you, but I really think it's important, and continually checking in on him and saying, hey, have you taken a look at that paperwork today, until maybe you bug him enough that, he does it. But yeah, I think that's a fine. Yeah.
Do violent video games make you violent?
So violent. No, actually, studies show that there's no correlation. So, turns out, yeah.
You talked about auditory hallucinations
Uh-huh.
and having an effect on a certain part of the brain. Is there some physiological effect that causes the hallucinations, or does it just show up as a physiological effect on a part of the brain?
So that's complicated. I don't think we really know necessarily. Some research shows that in schizophrenia, there's a lesser volume of white matter in the brains, and so that can cause some connectivity issues with neurons, and so, that may kind of be a cause, but whether or not, I don't know whether they're born that way, or if we're looking at brains later in time and seeing the effect over time. I don't know. We don't really know the cause of it necessarily, but that's something that's being researched. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael.